Now that we have a bit clearer of an idea about what questionable research practices are, how prevalent they are, and how easy they are for people to kind of fall into doing, what are some things that we can do to reduce the likelihood of these things? A lot of this has to do with openness and transparency and hoping to change the institutional structures around the pressure to publish. Um, a main thing that we can do on an individual level is just increase how much we're disclosing in our papers. Our method sections, like I've told you before, should be detailed enough that someone reading it could do exactly what you did in your study. Same with your results section. People should be able to exactly recreate your analysis from what you did. It's good to even include code for the types of statistical tests that you did whenever you can. But I've also talked in an earlier video about how there are pretty strict word limits in journals. But happily, most journals have, as they've moved more primarily online, and you can access supplementary files and online only appendices and things like that. There are places where you can upload all sorts of things like your data, your code, your methods, your survey questions, anything that you could think of that contributed to your study, you can put it online. But it requires that individual decision that eventually aggregates into collective action for this to actually make a difference. And that applies to all of these things. We all have to make these hard individual decisions that sometimes might be a little more work for us in the short run to make science better in the long run. You also ideally would be doing what's called pre-registration. So some of those problematic practices we talked about were hypothesizing after the results are known, like just finding things and saying you predicted them. One easy way around this is to pre-register your hypotheses, your rules for data collection, and how you plan to analyze it. And there are plenty of repositories now to do this. The main one we'll talk about in a moment is called the Open Science Framework. But these are places where you can make projects where you can put up your predictions. You can even embargo them for up to 2 years, so you don't have to like share them before you've collected the data or anything, but they're stored there and dated so people can tell that you hypothesized before you actually collected your results. So that cuts down on that sort of harking and p-hacking to some extent because you're like locked into an analytic strategy, and then later on people can look at your paper and say, hey, you didn't do what you said you were going to do, why not? And it would reduce those deviations between people's plans and what they find. Another part of this openness is just sharing data. A lot of people might treat data as kind of proprietary or their property in some ways, proprietary or their property. But sharing data and making it open, as long as it doesn't violate anything about the confidentiality or the privacy of your participants, can be very, very useful. So other people can reanalyze your data and check to see if you've done things correctly. Now, some of these things, especially letting people check up on your results afterwards, can be like kind of daunting and threatening, especially if you're someone who has a lot of vested interest in your career in a particular research question or theory. So we'll talk about that in just a minute again, but this does require some individual sacrifice, some choices to be responsible rather than acting in your self-interest all the time. And sometimes people are not particularly good at that. So this is a kind of ambitious set of goals, even though they may seem sort of straightforward. But again, I mentioned this already. One of the main things that we have going for us in terms of being able to do this stuff easily is something called the Open Science Framework. So the Center for Open Science, spearheaded by a social psychologist named Brian Nosek and another scientist named Jeffrey Spies, they have created this nonprofit that has gotten National Science Foundation grants and lots of private funding to be a repository online for people to pre-register their hypotheses, put their study materials in there, put in their data, their code, all kinds of stuff. And in a lot of ways, it kind of functions as a place to, almost like a Google Drive or Dropbox, where you can keep these materials, update them as you are changing them, and make sure your workflow is kind of steady through there. So this is a really, really important step to have something like this that people buy into and trust. It's been a good source of positive change. The Center for Open Science more broadly also is a big collaborator in a couple of projects to increase replication and what we can learn from replication. So they started things called the Mini Labs project and the reproducibility projects. And before I talk about those things specifically, I want to kind of differentiate between these two ideas, reproducibility and replicability. Reproducibility is the idea that you could engage in replication of a study, that a study is reproducible to the extent that you provide enough details that you can duplicate it, that someone else would be able to redo your study the way that you did it. Replicability is the extent to which people are going to find the same results when they're running that same study. So a study could be reproducible and not replicable, which happens frequently. You can reproduce it, but the results are not the same. That would be an instance of reproducibility without replicability. And there are different types of replications that we might undergo, things that even read about earlier in the semester. But the two different kinds would be exact replications and conceptual replications. Exact replications are just what they sound like. You're doing exactly what the prior researchers or what even you did in the past. Conceptual replication might be doing it in a different context or with different measures or different manipulations to show that your findings are not completely contingent on the way that you chose to do the study. And ideally, to have any confidence in any particular effect, we would have many exact and many conceptual replications to be able to show that it's robust across samples and methodologies. But that's a lot of work. And when the incentives are in the field to publish new, exciting, original things, who's going to replicate? No one. No one publishes replications. Frequently, if you send in a paper to a journal and it's redoing an old study from someone else, they say this is not original enough. Those norms are changing, but they're changing slowly. So we need incentives to have people actually do replications. So one of those things is the Mini Labs project that the OSF is a partner in, or the Center for Open Science, rather. So they decided on a group of studies that could be conducted relatively easily, and they asked lots and lots of different labs that maybe wouldn't always have the resources and time to get a study underway to just replicate them, so that a lot of people could do these same studies over and over again. And these are classic things like anchoring and adjustment heuristics, the correlation between different implicit and explicit attitudes, gambler's fallacy, how you frame things, sex differences in math attitudes, different priming things, how we test norms, like classic studies that just don't have enough replications of them. Then they had all these different labs, dozens in some cases, run these studies. You can see there's some in the US, some that are international, and we're comparing here the original effect size, most of them around 1 or so, or between 0.5 and 1. These original effect sizes in X's and the average effect sizes for these Mini Labs replications in the big circles with some confidence intervals here, and all the individual studies plotted as smaller circles. So you're seeing that some of these things we maybe have actually underestimated how big like anchoring and adjustment effects are, for example. So we could be wrong in both directions, right? Something might even matter more than we thought. There are other things that seem to matter about as much as we thought. And there are other things like the effect of, certain types of contact interventions and, priming in some senses that maybe don't seem to really exist. You can see the average effect sizes here are hovering around 0. So maybe these things that we originally had some confidence in don't actually work the way that we thought. And efforts like these to do all these basically mini meta-analyses to find out if these effects are real are the only way that we can really gain any confidence about whether effects are replicating. So this is an initial, this was Mini Lab Projects 1. There are other ones that are underway or completed. Actually, I think as of this recording, all of these are actually done. That you're doing different conceptual replications here. You're testing whether like the subject pools that we use in psychology. Lots of undergrads participate in studies, and there's probably systematic things about doing a study earlier versus later in a semester that are going to affect your results. So that's an important thing to study. Other things might be about specific effects, like terror management theory. Without getting into too much detail about that, that's the idea that humans are in a unique sort of position in the animal world of being aware of our own deaths, and that is a scary thing for us. And to cope with that fear of death, we cling to cultural and social institutions to feel as though we're part of something that's going to last long after we're gone. And this is an area of research that people have always been a little skeptical about, some people, and they've recently completed this fourth Many Labs project, finding that, for good reason, the original terror management results don't seem to replicate. So the original researchers there and people that work in that area need to grapple with that. And again, this fits into our idea about the incentive structures, because if you are Tom Shazinski or the other researchers that have, put your career into these areas, and you are faced with the news that your results are not replicable, and it seems that you're, at the best case, talking about things that only you're able to find, that's a problem. So it can be a blow to somebody's ego to find that your results are not as clear as you thought. So these are very important projects to help us understand better if these things actually replicate, and they give other smaller labs the chance to contribute to this really important work. But as a result of these different things, some journals have changed their editorial policies. They're more likely to accept replications or null results, meaning your hypothesis was not supported, and having special issues on some of these things have, led people to be more likely to do these types of replication efforts. Another one that I mentioned, the Center for Open Science is involved in, the Reproducibility Project, kind of a landmark test of whether some classic study, or not classic studies, but studies from randomly selected issues of journals in 2008 that happened to be replicated. So they tried to do as close of replications as they could with input from the original study authors, used all open materials and data. And just think for a minute, out of these 100 studies, how many of them do you think replicated? Got your number in mind? Well, the number is 38 out of 100. So not good. Only about a third of things replicating in the way that we might like to see. So there are a number of reasons that they might not have replicated. And not all of those reasons are that the original authors are lying or fraudulent. In fact, they're probably not. It's probably just that they found something by chance, or there's something about the context in which they collected the data that's different from when people tried to replicate them. So there might be certain boundary effects going on. There might be hidden moderators, we call them, things about the setting into which the data was collected originally that are different from the data that were collected later. Or maybe the effects don't exist. Maybe they're not real. And for some of those 62 studies that didn't replicate, they're probably not real. And we need to have more replications to be able to have a better idea of the extent to which those types of things are real. So to wrap this stuff up, I want to leave you with some thoughts in general about science and how we should think about it. Because I think when we think of science, generally, we tend to idealize it and think that it's this perfect machine that's going to help us march toward the future. But that perfect machine is not perfect. It's run by people that make selfish individual decisions, and we need to work together to make those things better. So when you are consuming science, even if you don't go on to be a scientist, you're going to hear about science in the news, in your everyday conversations, in your chosen field. So when you encounter scientific findings, be skeptical. That doesn't mean cynical. Those are different things. You need to be skeptical and think about how people arrived at their conclusions and whether the methods they used to arrive at them were appropriate or not, and how they're interpreting things are appropriate. So if you're looking at one study with a small sample size, that's probably not a great thing to hang your head on, right? We would want replications and meta-analyses to have a real confidence in a particular effect. We also need to think about science rather than being a statement about what is true, we need to think about science as an endeavor to find the truth. Science is the pursuit of truth. So think about how science was 10 or 15 or 100 or 1,000 years ago. A lot of those things that we took as truth in the past are now wrong. Think about how we didn't used to understand germs. We didn't used to know that vaccination was possible. Those are things that we learned from science, although they would have sounded unreasonable to people in the past. We're constantly learning new things and leaving our less accurate and less nuanced understanding of the world behind. So a lot of the things that you learn in your classes now are probably wrong, but moving forward incrementally is how we make gains and we come to better understandings of things. So there are other examples too, like germ theory. We didn't used to understand that stuff. Now we know about bacteria and viruses, that it's not, bad humors in our bodies. And we're going to learn more about sickness, just like we're going to learn more about psychology and priming and relationships and clinical psychology and medications. We're going to get better at these things, but only if we all work together in a responsible way. And we're going to learn about everything, but we need to do it in this better way that we frankly have not been doing. And this, again, is not just psychology. This is everyone, especially places where there are, financial interests involved. So when you are consuming science, again, be skeptical. Don't believe everything you read. If something is sensational, it's probably not true. And there are markers that you might want to look at, like if the claims that people are making don't fit with the things that they're testing, or if their sample sizes are very small. There might be reason for skepticism there. If there aren't replications, if there aren't meta-analyses, then again, there's reason to be skeptical. If people are hesitant to share their data, if they're hiding something, perhaps, if people didn't do anything wrong and there aren't like confidentiality or ethical issues, then they should share it. And if they don't, that's probably some kind of red flag. So we need to try to make sure people are we're reducing these incentives to make questionable research decisions and make sure that people are trying to be responsible and contribute to our understanding as human beings rather than just trying to keep their career going along. And these are hard decisions to make. We're all self-interested to some extent. But in the long run, if we don't work together to do these things better, then we don't learn anything. And we waste lots of time and money as well. So be skeptical, don't be cynical, but think about how people's conclusions are sometimes separate from the data that they're talking about, and try to make sure that connection is as strong as possible.